Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to install stainless steel brake lines on a 370Z. So the first thing we're going to do, as with almost any car project, is get the car up into the air, so let's get to it. Alright, so the car is now jacked up into the air. You don't need to go up too high with it, just high enough so that way you can get the wheel off of the ground, so that way you can take it out. Now, I would probably recommend loosening these bolts before you begin jacking it up unless you're going to use a power tool. That way you can take the wheel off a lot easier. So the next step is going to be removing all four wheels on the car. So now that we got the wheels removed, the next thing we're going to do is just go ahead and pop the hood, because for this install we will need to keep an eye on our brake fluid line. And we'll go ahead and pop the brake fluid cover here. Alright guys, so we're just going to get our feet wet by starting off with the rear, because this end's going to be a lot easier. This is the rubber hose that we are looking at replacing. For this bottom nut right here that we're going to have to take off, it should just take a 12mm socket. The nut up here is a 10mm. To remove it, I probably wouldn't recommend using your traditional crescent wrench. You should probably use one of these flange nut wrenches. These have that little extra bit that wrap around at the top there, just to make sure that you don't round the nut. So we'll go ahead and use that to be able to take this top one off. And again, this was 10mm and 12mm down here. We'll just loosen up both of these. And once you have that 10mm nut removed from the top, you should be able to get a set of needle nose pliers and then grab on this clip here to be able to pull it out this way. Now, as soon as we loosen both ends, we are going to start dripping some brake fluids, so I would have your pan ready here. And you're going to want to replace this line as quick as possible, so that way you minimize the amount of fluid that you lose. When we are replacing this line, we are going to be using the smaller of the two stainless steel hoses with this curved piece here on the bottom. So the way that installing this line is going to work is we'll just go ahead and thread the top. That should be fairly easy. Just slide it into that clip. For this bottom banjo nut here, we're going to put this banjo bolt in with one of these copper washers kind of sandwiching between the nut and the bolt there. And then we will place another copper O-ring on the top. This is just to kind of seal it and prevent any of that brake fluid from leaking out. Again, as soon as you loosen this bolt, you want to make sure you move quickly to minimize the amount of fluid that you lose. Again, have that oil pan ready, because you will begin to lose some brake fluid here. Want to make sure you don't get any of that brake fluid on the paint, because it will corrode the paint. There it goes. Okay, so that is the top bolt unthreaded now. Now we just need to remove this little clip here, so I'm going to grab our needle nose pliers. There we go. I find it's easier to just rock the clip back and forth, that way you can loosen it. And now we have our brake line removed, so now we're going to want to quickly go ahead and replace the new brake line to be able to limit the amount of fluid that we're leaking here. Here I'm threading the aftermarket banjo bolt that Z1 sent with my stainless steel brake line kit. However, I found out later that these bolts snap fairly easily, so I'd recommend you use the OEM banjo bolts that were already installed on your caliper. So that is the banjo bolt loosely put in place with those two copper washers. Go ahead and try and thread the other side now. Make sure you tighten down both of these fittings really good with your wrenches, so that way you don't leak any brake fluid. Alright, so that is the new brake line installed now. I now finally have this clip installed. It took me a good 15 minutes to figure out a proper method to use here. I ended up just pushing it in as hard as I could with my fingers, and then I gave it a good smack with a rubber mallet, being careful not to hit the actual brake line, and that seemed to do the trick. And then of course I have this end tightened down as tight as it will go. So I actually have this 90-degree joint positioned in the wrong place. You want to make sure that it sits about parallel with the ground, oriented in the same way that the stock hose was, so that way it doesn't bump into any of these suspension members. So this brake line is now installed. Go ahead and repeat this with the passenger side. Throughout this entire process, you want to make sure you keep an eye on your brake fluid level. You don't want it to drop below the minimum line because then you're at risk of air getting into the master cylinder. So if you find that your brake fluid is running too low, make sure you top it off. Alright guys, so a couple additional points I want to make here. I've gone ahead and zip tied the stainless steel line to the hard line, as you can see here, just to keep the line out of the way. And then you want to make sure that this 90-degree joint is sitting up about parallel with the road. You don't want it to be hanging too low or it could bump into this bar here. You don't want to damage these lines, so you want to make sure that they're out of the way and they're installed in approximately the same orientation as the stock bolts have them in. And I ended up not using the banjo bolts that Z1 sent me because this is what happened with them. So they actually snapped while I was trying to tighten them in. I don't really know if these are like aluminum bolts or something. I wouldn't think so. But the thing just snapped on me while I was trying to tighten it in. And the threads aren't as deep as the stock bolts are. So fortunately, the part that was threaded in, I was able to just get out with my fingers, so it wasn't stuck in the threads. But yeah, I would be wary of the bolts that Z1 sends you. Normally they send you pretty quality parts, but these things were kind of cheap. So I've just got the stock bolt back in now because it'll work just fine. It's also a banjo bolt. So yeah, just be careful of that. So the brake lines in the front are a little more complicated. They start with the bolt on the caliper here, and then they run to this 90-degree box, I guess it is, that they use to attach to the knuckle. And then there's a hard line that flows behind the knuckle all the way to this side. So we'll have to undo this 10mm bolt as well. And then this line flows all the way up to another 90-degree box here, and then flows up to the 10mm clip that we have here. We're going to be replacing that entire line with just one simple piece like this. So we've got a lot of bolts to remove on this front part. So let's get started. But before I proceed, I'm going to go ahead and top off the brake fluid reservoir here just so that it gets a little more brake fluid, because we have been losing some while removing these brake lines, and you don't want this to fall too low. You don't want any air to get into like the master cylinder or anything. So I'm going to go ahead and top this off and then continue removing the brake lines. So I think I'll go ahead and start off by loosening the 10mm bolts on these two 90-degree adapters here, because I don't think these will leak any fluid when I do that. And then I'll proceed to loosen the other fasteners and remove these brake lines. Alright, so I kind of went silent on you guys for a while because I was just in a rush to try and get this brake line run in place. I've got this kind of loosely threaded in, as I do down here. If you'll notice, I do have the stainless steel line kind of running through the same path that the other brake line had been running in. That's because we're going to try and use these little mounts that Z1 provides to hook up to these bolts like that. So just kind of make sure you guys route it in the same way that the stock line was going. So let's go ahead and get these lines put in place. Alright, so the front and passenger side stainless steel line is now in. I've currently got all these brackets tightened down. You want to start everything off loose so that way you can position everything so you got plenty of clearance. A point that you really want to take note of is to make sure, if I can get it on the camera here, you want to leave plenty of room for the stainless steel line back here. You don't want it to be touching the centerpiece because you don't want that stainless steel line to rub on anything. Otherwise you could see some damage to the line. I've also got about a finger's width of space back here. So these are zip tied such that it won't bang against this piece. You've got this supporting bracket back here that holds the line. And then of course I have tightened down the connector here and have replaced that clip. So that is the front line now reinstalled, and we'll go ahead and do the driver's side, and then that should be it. Just of course remember to keep an eye on the brake fluid level, make sure it doesn't get too low. I wouldn't recommend filling up your brake fluid like I'm doing here. You might use a turkey baster. That's a more controlled method of being able to insert brake fluid into the reservoir. I ended up spilling some. If you do happen to get any brake fluid on your paint, you want to make sure you clean it up immediately because you don't want it to start eating through the clear coat. And then that is the driver's side done with the stainless steel lines, of course, zip tied so that they are not brushing up against everything. So that completes all 4 wheels for the stainless steel brake line install. And at this point you want to go around and just double check all of your fittings and make sure they're tight, that way you're not leaking any brake fluid. And then it is absolutely crucial that you perform a brake flush, that way you can get any of the air out of the system from installing your new lines as well as any dirt that might have gotten in there. If you don't do this, your brakes may not work properly, so it is critical that you perform a flush. I will leave a link in the description below to a video I did showing you guys how you can perform a brake flush, so that way you can do it yourselves. And that is it for this video, guys. Give it a thumbs up if you found it helpful. Maybe hit the subscribe button down below. I do have some more videos coming up pretty soon, including my installation of the new EBC brake rotors and yellow pads that I'm currently getting installed on there to be able to prepare it for track use. So make sure you stay tuned for that. Anyways, thank you guys for watching, and I will see y'all in the next one. Later.